Well, several months ago, Jill and I were hanging out in a candy shop. And I don't know if you guys like candy shops, but I love candy. I'm addicted to sugar, just a little time of confession. So anytime I go to a candy shop, I'm like, man, I feel like a little boy again. There's just like, I love it, and I love going in. And so we're hanging out at this candy shop, and we're looking at all the different things, and they have this whole aisle that's like the nostalgic, old school candy, and then they have this like 3-foot gummy bear, and I'm like checking it out, going, that's wild, and we're having a great time in there. And so I pick up a few things, and we walk up to, to pay for the stuff, and I'm, as you walk up, they have all these like things on the counter trying to get you to buy more. And as we look, I see something that I've never seen before that started to intrigue me, and I start reading it. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but here's what I saw next to the cash register right there. Have you seen this, the Pokey One Chip Challenge? I mean, that thing, I started thinking about that, and then all of a sudden, as I'm sitting there, I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, my son, my second oldest son, Luke, I mean, that guy can eat anything hot, and it doesn't bother him at all. He's like, has a steel palate. I'm like, jalapenos, whatever kind of hot sauce or salsa. I mean, whatever it is, like, he can eat it, and he's just totally fine. So I'm in one of those moments, I'm standing there with a couple pieces of candy and looking at this thing, and I'm like, should I do this? Like, I think the boys would have fun, I think, and then I look at the price, and it's $20 for one chip. Like, not several bags, one chip, and that caused me to pause a little bit, but I'm fairly spontaneous, and so I was like, I should do it. I think the boys all get a kick out of it. And so I buy this one $20 chip. I bring it home, we all get in the kitchen, and we all get together, and I'm like, Luke, I got a surprise for you. And he comes in, and I'm like, Luke, look at this thing. Have you seen this? And he heard of it, and I was like, Luke, would you do it? We're all kind of, egging him on, like, do it, Luke. And he's like, fine, yeah, no problem. And so he takes the one chip made of Carolina Reaper peppers, and apparently those are the hottest pepper, like 100 times hotter than a jalapeno, and he takes it, a big old bite of that chip. And Luke, he looks at us all, and he's like, no big deal. Just chomping on it, smiling, going, come on, give me something hotter. Well, about 15 seconds into that chip, legit panic sets in. Like, he spontaneously starts sweating, like no kidding. And then he looks at Jill, and he's like, Mom, like, oh my gosh, like something's happening. And so he starts chugging water. He's like, what do I do? And she's like, drink some milk. And so he's like chugging milk in the kitchen, spilling all over him. And he's like, what else? And she's like, sour cream, maybe. He hates sour cream. And he takes the thing, and he's squeezing it, and it's getting all over. And I'm watching this whole thing. And here's the thing I hate. As a dad, I'm watching this, and there's my son in pain, and I'm laughing at it. I'm going like, I should be caring for him. No, not happening. I'm just laughing. All the boys are laughing. Jill's, she's in the moment. She's being a good mom, but I'm not. And long story short, the whole thing happens. I mean, Luke, he looks back and totally regrets eating that chip. He's like, I'll never do that again. I mean, that was like serious hotness. And I have two regrets. One of the regrets is what I just shared. I mean, laughing at my son in pain. I'm like, maybe I shouldn't do that. I don't know, And the other regret is paying $20 for one chip. I mean, come on. That is crazy. Now, guys, I share that with you, and I start that way because we're in part 2 of the series that we kicked off last week where we're talking about regrets. And the reality is in every single one of our lives, regardless if you're a Christian or not, it really doesn't matter. Every single one of us can look back in our lives and look at something and say, yeah, I've got regrets. And there's things that we can all laugh about and say, yeah, that's a funny thing. And we can all get around and share our stories, 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But the reality is, in your life and in my life, in all of our lives, there are also things we can look back on in a much bigger way, in a much more emotional way, and say, man, those were some big regrets. That I think if we're really honest, and we're all brutally honest, we could look back and we could say, yeah, I've got some relational regrets. In that first marriage or that second marriage or the thing I said, the other year with my son or that with my daughter. I mean, we look back on those things and go, man, those are some of the most impactful ones. I wish I never would have done that. How could I have been so foolish? Or we think about financial regrets. That investment, I knew better, but what was I thinking, investing that amount of money? Or we think about perhaps professional regrets. Those ethical decisions, those character decisions, those expense reports. It's just like, man, once I was on the other side of that, and I'm just kicking myself. How could I have been so foolish with my job? And not only that, but we have moral regrets that we think back. And, today they just haunt us and we feel the guilt. And we think back to those things and we're going like, man, what was I thinking? How could I have been so foolish or academic or even spiritual? I mean, as a follower of Jesus Christ, perhaps you have said some things to your neighbors or to coworkers or people at school. And now you look back and you're like, how could I have said that? How could I have treated that person that way? I mean, Jesus was so clear. A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. Boy, I miss that. Man. And I think the reality is we can all look back on our lives and say, yeah, I talked myself into some of the most foolish decisions I could ever imagine. And we said last week, the reason why we do this is because we are great salespeople. In fact, the greatest salesperson you've ever met is the one looking back at you in the mirror. That your brain is so smart that when your heart has a desire, a want, or an emotion, your brain will talk yourself into whatever your heart wants. And the point is, we all have regrets, don't we? That we look back on. And I think perhaps, if we're just talking, you would say, well, Buck, that's kind of the reality of life, isn't it? I mean, regrets seem inevitable. They do. I mean, it's just going to happen. We're human. We all make mistakes. It's just part of life. And plus, Buck, that's how we learn. I mean, you make this choice and you're like, oh man, you look back, what was I? Isn't that how we progress? Isn't that how we learn? And all of that is 100% fair. I think that's part of the discussion. But what if regrets are preventable? What if there's actually something you and I, starting today, can do to get ahead of our regrets, to get to a place at the end of this year in 2022 and look back and say, you know what, as I think about this whole year and all my relationships and all the bigger issues of life, I have little, or perhaps no regret. Is that possible for you and for me? As we said last week, the answer is absolutely. That's possible for every single one of us, regardless if you're a follower of Jesus or not. There are decisions and choices we can make to get ahead of our regret, and actually that ends up preventing regret. So guys, that's what we're talking about in this whole series. And if you weren't here last week, I want to strongly encourage you to go online. You can catch up on what we've said. We gave something so practical, so helpful that will really work in your life. And last week, we looked at one of the ancients in the Bible to kind of learn how to get ahead of our regret. And this week, we're also going to look at another ancient individual in the Bible. And this individual I want us to hear from today, his name is King David. Now, King David is arguably the most famous king of Israel. And if you know the story of King David, it's a fascinating story. I mean, he was the individual who was the architect. I mean, think about being this guy, the architect for the golden age of Israel. He established the infrastructure. He established the systems. He established a culture that led to more peace, more prosperity, like ridiculous amounts of prosperity and power than the nation of Israel has ever seen before or after. And you go, who was the architect of that? Who led that whole thing? Who was the leader? I want to learn some leadership lessons. That would be King David, the most famous king of Israel. Now, here's just kind of a side note that's pretty interesting, I think, when it comes to King David. Did you guys know up until 1995, when it came to the person of King David, that, scholars and academics and, historians would say, well, King David is a cute story, and I think it's good for children, but you shouldn't really take it seriously because he is a mythical figure. He's just made up. That's just a made-up story in the Bible. There's absolutely no historical evidence. There's no archaeological evidence of King David ever existing. And they were 100% right. There was zero evidence outside the Bible of King David existing until 1995. Because in 1995, in the little area of Israel called Tel Dan, they discovered this tablet. It's called the Tel Dan inscription. And on this tablet, with the highlighted piece, it says, the house of David in Aramaic. And they dated this tablet, and it's 900 years before Christ, during the time of King David. It is the first objective, concrete, historical evidence, and since then there's been loads of evidence, archaeological evidence since 1995, that says King David, when we talk about him, and this is important regardless if you're a Christian or not, that we're talking about a real person in history, that objectively we can point back to archaeological points and say there are data points to say he's a real human and he really lived in our history. That's who we're talking about today, King David. And around the story of King David, or around the life of King David, there are two names that are most synonymous with his story. And the two names that are most synonymous with King David are Goliath and Bathsheba. Goliath and Bathsheba. Goliath is a story that perhaps if you grew up in church, you heard of the big giant, and David is victorious, and you should be victorious in your life, that whole thing. And then Bathsheba is much more of an adult story. It's an adult story that, kind of intrigues us as adults, kind of scares us a little bit as adults. But those are the two people who are most primarily synonymous with King David. And today what I want to do is I want us to look at the story of Bathsheba and King David. And guys, I got to be upfront with you. This is a story that as a church over the last, since we started Northpoint, we've probably looked at this story maybe 5, 6, 7 times, quite a bit. In fact, Jordan, just a few months ago, he talked about David and Bathsheba. But today, here's what we're going to do different. We're actually going to look at the story from a different angle. We're going to learn something that is so helpful, legit. It's really, really helpful for every single one of us, again, if you're a Christian or not, to get ahead of our regret and prevent our regret from getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So today, that's the story I want us to jump into. So let's get going. Let's jump in to King David and Bathsheba. Here's what it says in 2 Samuel. It says, in the spring of the year, when kings normally go off to war, David sent Joab, that's his general, his main general, Joab, and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, this is important, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. Now, guys, that's important because kings never ever stay behind when their general and their army are out in the seasons of war. During that time of history, that would have never happened. But King David, this guy, everything he touches turns to gold. He's won so many battles at this point. And he's thinking to himself, hey, I've got more peace, more prosperity, more power, more influence. Look at my titles, look at my accomplishments. And so what does he do? He says, I'm just going to chill. I'm going to chill back in Jerusalem. I'm going to hang back. I'm going to embrace my passivity as a man and reject my responsibility as a man. And I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. I'm just going to hang out. The guys, the war, Joab, he's got this. I don't need to accept my responsibility. I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. That was his first mistake. So he's hanging out in Jerusalem. Everybody's fighting. He should be there with his men, but he's not. And the story continues. It says, one evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of his palace. Now, another interesting kind of archaeological side note here that I think is pretty fascinating. Up until 2005, people doubted the whole, the palace of, David and all this kind of stuff. But then in 2005, which is just 15 years ago, or just over 15 years ago, which is pretty wild to think about, Dr. Mazer, and here she is, the late Dr. Mazer, she's an archaeologist and her team, under the visitor center of the city of David, discovered the palace of David. And just the archaeological side of things that have happened just in the last 15 years. I'm just telling you, it's a really fascinating time to be alive as a follower of Jesus Christ and learning so much about the Bible that the Bible is just not this hocus pocus, mythical, made up book. It is a historical document after document after document of kings and palaces and cities. And we're discovering so much in just today's history. So here he is. Back to the story, in his palace that we have archaeological evidence of today. And he's on the roof of his palace. He's just kind of hanging out. And what happens? Well, the story continues. It says, from the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was beautiful. And David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now, immediately, this is a context you may not know, but immediately, David knows Uriah. Uriah is one of David's best friends. Uriah is one of the elite of the elite of the elite of the Israelite army. Think of like a Navy SEAL. Think of special forces. There's only a few, and they have special missions that they go on. That's Uriah. He's the stud of all studs in terms of a military guy and a soldier. He's the dude. And him and King David have fought so many specialized things, have gone into some of the hardest battles in the hardest areas. And they have fought shoulder to shoulder for years, and they have been victorious together. They knew one another. Their lives were woven together. They had this liminal space. And you know what liminal space is? That's when you experience some profound things with someone that you can sit, on a porch with them and not have to say a single word, and there's such intimacy and such relational connection. That was Uriah. And he knew Uriah as his friend. This is one of his best friends. And his wife, she's smoking hot. And he's thinking, wow, well, now he knows. So does he do what we said last week, right? Does he do what we talked about? Hey, when there's something that comes your way, and you're like, before you get going, can you just pause? Did David pause as we talked about last week? Did he remind himself that his heart is deceitful above all things? At least 51%. That every single one of our hearts are 51% go, yeah, okay, let me pause. Uriah's wife, let me pause. Okay, my heart is really prone to deceive me. Let me just think about that truth. And did he pause and just tell himself the truth? Did he just say, okay, what is true? What's true? What's true? That's not my wife. What's true? That's Uriah's wife. What's true? He's one of my best friends. Did he pause and tell himself that? And did he pause and ask himself the question, what does God say? Because God is clear in the 7th commandment, do not commit adultery. And God is not clear on commandments to oppress you, to take away your freedoms. Good Lord. He's clear on his commandments to liberate you, because sin complicates this already very difficult life. Did he remind himself of any of that? Did he pause? 30 seconds he could have paused and perhaps changed his disposition in that moment with that temptation. No. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, with whom he wanted. He did what kings do. And here's what happens. Then David sent the messengers to get her. She came to him and he slept with her. Then she went back home. He crossed the line God has spoken clearly on and said, don't cross it. And again, God doesn't put these lines in our life to oppress you and to rob you from what you so hope to experience. I promise you, he puts those in your life to liberate you and allow you to have more freedom and feel more alive than you've ever felt before. But you gotta trust him, because sin complicates and layers life. And he sins and turns his back on what God has said. So, does it get complicated? What happens? Do you just get away with it? Here's what happens. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. Now it's complicated. And I'm telling you, as I read this passage this week, I thought to myself, that's it, right there. That moment for David, what he's facing, that tension in that moment, is a moment you will face and I will face, regardless if you are a Christian or not. Not in the same context, but in all of our lives, we make decisions. And when we make those decisions and cross whatever line that may be, we have a choice. And the choice is either to confess or to conceal. To confess or to conceal. When you walk into work and you know what the boss expects of you, and you know what you should have done, and you said you were going to do it, and you didn't do it, and you know it, and the boss says, hey, can you update me on what's going on? In that moment, in that very moment, you feel the pressure. And you can confess or you can conceal. When your parents come home and they're like, hey, how'd it go tonight? What you got to do? Or hey, how's it going with him, or how's it going with her? And they're asking you about those areas, and you know the truth. In that moment, you can make a decision to confess or to conceal. When there's that habit that has caused so much havoc in your marriage, and you promised her you'd never do it again, but now that habit's starting to creep itself back in, and it's subtle, and you're like, you keep telling yourself it's no big deal, but now it's starting to get a grip on you again. And she says, hey, can we talk about that? Hey, how's that going? We haven't checked in a while. In that moment, you can confess or you can conceal. When you have that friend, that trusted friend that you call an accountability partner, maybe somebody who holds you accountable and you're like, hey, in 2022, this is the area of my life I really need to get right. Would you ask me about this? And they ask you about it a week later, you can confess or you can conceal. Or if you have a secret and no one knows, but you know, and no one's asking you about it, you have the tension David does. You can confess or you can continue to conceal. And do you know where we lean? Do you know where I'm tempted to lean? To where David was tempted to lean? To conceal. Conceal. I mean, because here's what we think. Oftentimes we think, well, come on, I'm powerful enough. I'm smart enough. I'm sophisticated enough. I'm rich enough. I've got enough things. I can conceal this. I can make it go away. The consequences are going to go away. And here's what we tell ourselves. And this is a total myth. And you may not believe it, but at least I'd like you to consider it. But the myth that we tell ourselves is this: as long as no one knows, everything will be okay. Hey, as long as I can cover this up and I'm sophisticated enough, everything will be okay. Just conceal, conceal, conceal. And part of it is because we have these insecurities and these fears inside of us that say, you know what? I'm telling you, if I confess, man, that's going to be a big consequence. I'm not going to do that. And I fear so much of the confession. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to conceal because I can carry the guilt. And yes, she doesn't know. Yeah, he doesn't know. Yeah, they don't know. And yes, it's hurting the relationships just a little bit, but I try to justify how it's not hurting the relationships in my mind. And so I'm going to conceal because I can handle the guilt because I don't want to deal with the consequences of confession. So we end up concealing. And that's what David did. He concealed. He lied to cover up his lies. He deceived some more to cover up his deceptive act. And he carried more guilt. What he did with his guilt is he made more decisions that created more guilt. And that's how you conceal. That's how you have to conceal. And so what does David do? If you're familiar with the story in a short summary, David says, well, now she's pregnant, what do I do? So he decides to come up with a master plan, calls for Uriah from the battlefield. They're all in battle. Uriah comes back to the palace. King David says, hey, buddy, pal, we've gone through a lot of life together. Yeah. And Uriah's like, hey, King David, what's up? Why'd you call me off the field? And he's like, hey, I just want to get a status update. How are things going? And that's a little confusing. And David not being in war is a little confusing. He should be there with the men. This is all really confusing. But Uriah obliges. He's loyal to his king. And he tells him, here's what's going on, the whole thing. And it gets late. And then David's like, here's his plan. Hey, why don't you go home? it's late. You don't need to go back to the battlefield. Hang out with, your wife Bathsheba, right? Have some sexy time. Go for it. Because, you've been on the field. Come on, I'm your friend. I want to just do something good for you. Next morning, David wakes up. Uriah never went home. Slept outside the palace doors because he's a loyal man. He's a man of character. He tells David this. Imagine that moment, that Uriah confronts David with that kind of character. My men are on the battlefield. That's what Bathsheba and I agreed to. That's where my responsibility lies in this season. And I got to go. Can you imagine David in that moment? He's like, oh my gosh. But what does David do? He lies, he deceives, he continues to conceal. He decides his second attempt to try to get him drunk, gets them all, liquored up that whole night, says, hey, go hang out with your wife. And Uriah, the same thing, doesn't go home, comes back. And then David goes, fine. He writes a letter, seals it with the king's seal, gives it to Uriah, says, hey, man, probably says, hey, I'll be praying for you. You go out there on the battlefield, man, I'm for you. We're good friends. Goes on the field, goes back to battle. He gives the letter that David gave him to his the general Joab. Joab opens the letter, and in summary it says, put Uriah at the front of the lines, have him killed. Well, Joab's the general. He's thinking there's a reason why my loyalty to my king, there's a reason why he's saying this. So he believes the best. Puts Uriah at the front of the lines, and he dies. News gets back to Bathsheba and King David. And King David goes, yes, it worked. No one knows. Concealment is going to win the day. And the moral of the story for you and for me is the better you can conceal, the less regret you'll have. You guys ready to pray? That's it. Right? No. I mean, if you know, that's what we think, don't we? We think, I get it, I'm with you, man. But if you know the story of King David, oh my gosh. You know, the story of King David, the first half of his life is really inspirational. It's like, wow, look at this man, and amazing in so many things. Did you know what, like, Bible scholars and theologians and people, when they just do kind of an observation of the second half of the life of King David, they summarize the second half of his life with one word: regret. Gigantic regret. And if King David were here, I would imagine he would say, yeah, the thing I did with Bathsheba, that wasn't good. And there's consequences in that. But I'm telling you, the reason why there's so much regret in the second half of my life is because I believed a lie. My brain deceived me into believing a myth. And my regret was around the consequences of concealment. I mean, you read what happens in King David's life. My goodness, it is terrible. I mean, the baby that Bathsheba's pregnant with, the baby dies, ends up dying right after birth. I mean, the whispers begin to happen because you truly can't conceal. People can sniff things. There's something going on here. Before long, you know, his children begin to lose respect for him. You know, the people of Israel begin to lose respect for him. And then one of his older sons, Amnon, rapes his daughter Tamar. And David should step in as a father and do something with what's going on in his family. That's his responsibility. But again, he's ridden with guilt because of what he's chosen to do. He's demonstrating passivity. And so his son, Absalom, has to step in and be a dad. And he steps in and he talks and confronts his brother Amnon about what he did and eventually kills Amnon. Now 2 sons have died. And then Absalom has so much hate and anger against his father because his father has abandoned his responsibilities. And so he goes to war with David. This is all public. And here's the people of Israel depending and looking to David's leadership. And now Absalom kicks his father out of the palace, takes his wives and concubines, and in that time in history, he slept with him publicly on the top of his palace to show all the people of Israel, hey, I'm the king, I have power, and my father is nothing. Absalom and David go to war. David's general Joab finds Absalom in a precarious position and kills him. When you read about that story, it crushes the heart of David. And then he dies. And his son Solomon, another son he had with Bathsheba, becomes the king. But that's the rippling effect of his concealment continues to happen. Because one of Solomon's very first things he does as a king is he kills his brother, his older brother, Adonijah. And he sends an assassin and has him murdered. If you take the second half of King David's life, it is full of regret, and I guarantee if he were here today, he would say, I'm just telling you. It came from concealment. And here's how this works, is that when we make a decision and we make a choice, a regrettable decision and choice, yes, it's regret. Yeah, man, it's like, gosh, you know, I shouldn't have done that. We've all made those decisions. But when you conceal, your regret grows. When you lie, your regret continues to grow. When you deceive some more to cover up the lies and cover up the deception, your regret grows some more, and it continues to grow and grow and grow until it becomes the size of King David's kind of regret. And it controls your life, and it's so behind the scenes, and there's so much energy and a lack of freedom because concealment. And I promise you, if King David was here, he would say, yes, the decision with Bathsheba, I'm not trying to cover that up. That's a big deal, and I shouldn't have done it. But I'm telling you, the biggest regret I have is to conceal, because it grows your regret bigger and bigger and bigger. And I guarantee King David would say, whatever it cost, whatever the consequence, whatever it takes, the thing to get ahead of your regret growing bigger and bigger and bigger is to confess. Confess, whatever it is. And so when you hear that, I mean, When I hear that, it's like, oh, well, practically, what does that mean for you and I? I thought about that this week, and I wrote a few things down, and this is just to go, where does this land with us? How do we do this? Where does this fit in our lives? And this is not an exhaustive list, but I wrote some statements down. And it just kind of helps us kind of prime the pump when it comes to confess. Think about this. When you have to lie to cover something up about your past or your present behavior, if that's happening, if there's something in your past or your present behavior and you're lying about it and you know you are, that is a clear signal. It is time to confess. Or what about this? When you are experiencing difficulty in your relationship now because of a situation in your past, it's time to confess. Because here's the thing you've got to understand, and I really hope all of us collectively, regardless if you're a Christian or not, you know this because this is experientially true, is that deception and intimacy cannot coexist. They can't. It's impossible. Because intimacy, by definition, is I am fully known. Intimacy is to say, this is all of me, this is my good, this is my bad, this is every single bit of me, and the choice of the person on the other side of you is either to reject you or to accept you and to love you. And when somebody says, hey, I see all of you, all of your good, all of your bad, I see all of it, and then they go, man, I accept you and I love you, what do you experience? You experience freedom and you experience intimacy. As long as there is deception, you will always have a wedge or a gap of intimacy in your marriage, with your son, with your daughter, with your best friends, with your parents. It doesn't matter what kind of relationship, there will be wedges, and they will get bigger and bigger and bigger as a result of the deception, because intimacy and deception cannot coexist. And if you know that, and there's a relationship now, and you see her and she's working and she's going to church and she's trying to read the Bible and she's praying and maybe she's even going to counseling and all this kind of stuff, and you're watching her go, what is this gap? And you know, it's time to confess. Or when you're pretending to be something you aren't, you've got that image. Hey, this is a story I tell people because I want this image to be true. This is a story I tell how the deal went down. This is a story about my family. This is whatever story it is. And it's not 100% true. Perhaps it's time to confess. Or when you're hiding something financially, maybe in business, with the IRS, or perhaps in your family, yeah, there's going to be a consequence for confession for sure. But it's far less than the consequences of concealment. You know, for Jill and I, several years ago, I remember I had to confess. And I'm responsible for the budget in our house. And so I keep it on my old school kind of budget keeper on a spreadsheet, you know, and every Friday I update our spreadsheet and here's our, you know, all our expenses and all that stuff. And so I'm doing that, and Jill sees some unexpected expenses and things are coming up, and she looks at me and she says, hey babe, I just want to check in. How's our finance? Are we doing good? And I look at her and I'm like, it's fine. We're good. We're good. We're all good. Hey, you know, trust in my leadership. I'm good. I'm good. That's a total bold-faced lie. And then the next month, some more things came up. And I knew what was going on with our budget. And I'm seeing our, you know, the credit card balance grow and things are happening. I'm like, oh, you know. And I could feel the guilt inside of me, but I couldn't, because my insecurities and the fear of her looking at me, and because I've messed up financially in the past, and her looking at me and going like, seriously, you did this again? I didn't want to see those eyes. I didn't want to feel the condemnation. She wasn't going to condemn me or shame me, but that's what I feared. And I feared I'm just not going to be respectful. I'm not going to be strong enough for her. So no way am I going to tell her. So month after month after month after month, about 5 to 6 months in, we're in a pickle financially. And I had so much guilt. And I could feel the intimacy, the connection wasn't there. There was a wedge. So I said, babe, can we talk? Sat down at our kitchen table. And I said, I'm so sorry, but I've messed up our finances. And I confessed where I messed them up, and I said, here's our plan going forward. Can we talk about that? And can we create some ways that you can just have ultimate visibility into our finances? Because this is a temptation for me. And yes, there was a break in our intimacy. There was some instability in our relationship as a result. There were some consequences. But please hear this, that short-term instability, what that led to as a result of confession, led to long-term intimacy. That we opened the door for her and I to reconnect and experience intimacy once more. If you're hiding something financially, I don't know the cost and the consequence, but I'm just telling you, it's far less than concealment. Last one. When you experience a distance with God, maybe it's just time to confess. Because can I push on you a little bit as if I'm not pushing hard enough? But oftentimes what I hear is, hey, intimacy and closeness with God, you know why? It's because of the church. It's not deep enough. The preaching's not deep enough. The ministries aren't enough. There's just not enough. There's not enough information, all this kind of stuff. And I don't want to minimize that at all. And I get that, and I feel that responsibility strong. And every week we're doing everything we can to improve and get better as a church. I take that personally. But maybe it has nothing to do with the church. Maybe it has to do with what's going on in here. That secret. That thing that nobody knows. Because if you're driving a wedge in your relationships, whatever they may be, that's impactful to your relationship with God. God sees that. And it's going to be almost impossible to experience that kind of intimacy with your Heavenly Father if you're not being honest with your wife, with your husband, with your kids, with your mom and dad, with that trusted friend, with that mentor, with that boss, or with that neighbor. I love what James says, the brother of Jesus. He gets this. James says, therefore confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. What he knows is what's true of you and what's true of me. That when Jesus came into the world, that he gave his life while we still deceived and sinned against him. He gave his life for us. And his love is big enough, his grace is deep enough, and his forgiveness is absolutely wide enough to take whatever it is that's going on in our life and bring healing and finally bring some freedom and restore the intimacy in our lives. How do we get ahead of our regret from getting bigger and bigger? Something you can do and I can do is we can choose to confess. So is there anything you need to confess? Is there anything as I've been talking that you know? And here's the thing, I get it, guys. And there's going to be this tension inside of you. And the tension is, I cannot tell because of the insecurities and the fear. There's going to be so many consequences. She's going to, he's going to, they're going to, I'm going to lose. All that fear is starting to fester up, isn't it? And on the other side, you're feeling the guilt. You're feeling the lack of intimacy. You're feeling the lack of freedom. And you're like, oh, I feel this tension. And so when you hear me say, is there anything you need to confess? Perhaps there's something that you want to respond and you say, I need to think about it. And that's fair. It's fair. For some, you're going to have a big conversation this afternoon or tonight, and that's important. And thinking about it, maybe I need to call the church and speak with a pastor. I need to call a mentor. I need to meet with a counselor. And I think that's wise. But can I just lean on you in one way? Something my counselor will say to me over and over and over is when I know I ought to do something, it's wise. It's to step into what God has called me to do. It's a step in towards freedom. And I know it's going to cause some short-term instability, but it could lead to long-term intimacy. She'll say to me, whatever it is, and I'll go, I'll think about it. And she says, Buck, don't think too long, because thinking is often the enemy of holiness. If you know what you ought to do, God's love and God's grace is big enough. And I'll leave you with this. As a pastor, I get to be in some of the hardest and most difficult situations in relationships and lives that you can imagine. And what I'll tell you is, yes, confession has a consequence, and that's legit and real. But it opens the door for long-term intimacy. It really does. And as a pastor, I've seen it time and time again where all hope is gone. Everybody's gone. This will never work out. It's impossible. It's blown up too big. And whatever you think that may be, I'm telling you that God is a God of hope, God is a God who restores. God is in the business of reconciling relationships. I've seen it time and time again, and it leads to something brighter and even more real and beautiful. But it starts with confession. Let me pray for us. Father, you know everything about us. And you know what we're talking about today. And you know where we're at. So I lay that before you. And I know you're big enough to handle it. I know the very Spirit that you've given us will walk with us and that we're not alone. And I know that you work all things for the good. That even when we can't see it, you are there. Even when we can't see how the pieces will all fit together, you are there and you're working. So God, give us the courage to do what you've called us to do. In Jesus' name, amen. Guys, thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next week.